Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Atlantic Ocean not as a border, but as a bridge. A vast, restless expanse of dark water separating two worlds that did not yet know how deeply their destinies would intertwine. Wooden ships creak in the night wind. Lanterns flicker. Sailors whisper prayers beneath unfamiliar stars. Across the Atlantic, empires did not arrive in a single storm of conquest, but in slow tides, in maps drawn by candlelight, in fragile alliances, in misunderstandings, in diseases unseen, in ambitions that quietly reshaped continents. Tonight, we'll drift through the long, gradual rise of European power in the Americas, not in battle cries, but in the quiet mechanics of exploration, settlement, and transformation. And if you find calm in slow history like this, consider subscribing so you never miss another peaceful journey through the past. Now, let's begin. Long before European sails appeared on the Atlantic horizon, the Americas were alive with civilizations whose histories stretched back thousands of years. The lands were not empty, nor silent, nor waiting to be discovered. They were filled with cities, roads, fields, stories, and societies as layered and complex as any in Europe, Africa, or Asia. To drift back into this world is to enter a vast human landscape already in motion, a place where empires rose. Farmers cultivated the earth with precision, merchants crossed mountains and jungles, and astronomers mapped the heavens from stone observatories. If you imagine the Americas before contact, imagine first the sound of life, the steady rhythm of feet in market plazas, the distant echo of drums across valleys, the soft rustle of maize fields moving in the wind, smoke rising from cooking fires at dusk, river canoes cutting quietly through morning mist. This was not a still world. It was one of constant movement, exchange, and adaptation. Across North America, societies developed in close relationship with their environments. In the eastern woodlands, vast forests shaped cultures that relied on seasonal cycles of hunting, farming, and gathering. Communities cultivated maize, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, crops grown together in agricultural harmony. Corn stalks provided structure for climbing beans, while squash leaves protected soil moisture below. This intercropping system was not accidental. It was the result of generations of ecological observation and refinement. Villages were often arranged with intention. Longhouses built from timber and bark, housing extended families connected by kinship rather than simple proximity. Governance in many of these societies functioned through councils, clan systems, and consensus building rather than centralized monarchies. Leadership required persuasion, wisdom, and trust, not only authority. Further south, in the Mississippi River Valley, the land rose into monumental earthworks, great mounds constructed by the Mississippian cultures. These were not small burial hills but carefully engineered platforms, supporting temples, homes of leaders, and ceremonial spaces. Cities like Cahokia flourished centuries before European arrival, with populations rivaling major European urban centers of their time. Trade networks extended for hundreds of miles, moving shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and stone from distant quarries. To the southwest, the desert held its own architectural wonders. The ancestral Pueblo peoples built multi-story dwellings from stone and adobe, some carved directly into canyon walls. Places like Mesa Verde stood as both shelter and symbol. Communities adapted to arid climates through irrigation, water storage, and agricultural terraces. Corn, cotton, and beans were cultivated in landscapes that to outsiders might appear unforgiving yet sustained life through careful stewardship. Moving into Mesoamerica, the scale of civilization expanded even further. Dense urban centers rose from jungles and highlands. Stone pyramids climbed toward the sky, their steps aligned with celestial movements. Ball courts, observatories, and temple complexes formed the ceremonial heart of city life. The Maya world, spread across present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, was composed of interconnected city-states rather than a single empire. Each had its own rulers, alliances, rivalries, and dynastic histories recorded in glyph-carved stelae. Writing systems flourished here, one of the most sophisticated in the pre-Columbian Americas, documenting astronomy, mathematics, ritual, and royal lineage. Mayan astronomers tracked planetary cycles with extraordinary accuracy. They calculated solar years, lunar movements, and eclipses using observatories built with architectural precision. Time itself was sacred, expressed through interlocking calendar systems that governed agriculture, ritual, and governance. Agriculture in the region adapted to diverse environments. In swampy lowlands, raised fields improved drainage and fertility. In hillsides, terracing prevented erosion. Cacao, maize, chili peppers, and cotton formed economic and cultural staples. Markets traded not only goods but ideas. Dyes, feathers, jade, ceramics, and obsidian tools moved along trade corridors linking distant populations. To the west, in central Mexico, the Mexica, often called the Aztecs, built one of the most remarkable urban capitals in the world, Tenochtitlan. Constructed on an island within Lake Texcoco, the city seemed to float on water. Causeways connected it to the mainland, while canals functioned as transportation routes lined with canoes. Agriculture here took the form of chinampas, raised agricultural beds built atop shallow lake waters. These floating gardens were astonishingly productive, yielding multiple harvests per year. Maize, tomatoes, flowers, and herbs grew in geometric abundance. The system sustained a dense urban population through ecological engineering, rather than land expansion. Markets in Tenochtitlan bustled daily, drawing tens of thousands of traders. Goods arrived from across Mesoamerica: jaguar pelts, turquoise, rubber, textiles, and foodstuffs. Standardized tribute systems supported imperial administration, while road networks and messengers maintained communication across vast territories. Religion permeated civic life, expressed through temple rituals, festivals, and cosmological symbolism embedded in architecture. Yet daily life also included artisans, teachers, engineers, and merchants, the quiet infrastructure of any thriving society. Southward, the Andes Mountains cradled another vast imperial system, Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire. Stretching along the western spine of South America, it encompassed deserts, highlands, and rainforests linked through administrative ingenuity. The Inca did not rely on wheeled transport or draft animals for heavy labor, yet they constructed one of the most extensive road systems in the ancient world, over 25,000 miles of stone-paved routes, suspension bridges, and mountain passes. Messengers called chasquis ran these roads in relay, carrying information encoded in quipu, knotted cord. Record systems used for accounting and communication. Terraced agriculture transformed steep mountain slopes into fertile farmland. Stone retaining walls captured soil and water, creating microclimates suitable for maize, potatoes, and quinoa. Irrigation canals distributed glacial meltwater with careful control. Cities like Cusco were designed with cosmic symbolism. Streets radiated outward like the lines of a puma, an animal sacred to Inca cosmology. Stone masonry reached extraordinary levels of precision. Massive blocks fit together without mortar so tightly that even a blade could not pass between them. Economic systems functioned through labor taxation rather than currency. Citizens contributed time and work, building roads, farming state lands, or serving in military campaigns. In return, the state provided food security, infrastructure, and disaster relief. Across Amazonia, societies adapted to rainforest ecosystems through agroforestry, soil enhancement, and riverine trade. Contrary to older assumptions of sparse habitation, archaeological evidence reveals large, organized communities managing forests through controlled cultivation in terra preta, nutrient-rich anthropogenic soil created through organic composting techniques. In the Caribbean, island societies navigated maritime networks linking archipelagos through canoe travel. Fishing, cassava cultivation, and inter-island exchange sustained vibrant communities long before transatlantic contact. What becomes clear when drifting across these regions is that there was no single American civilization, but a mosaic of thousands, each adapted to geography, climate, and cultural philosophy. Trade connected many of them. Turquoise from the American Southwest traveled into Mesoamerican markets. Obsidian blades moved across hundreds of miles. Feathers from tropical birds adorned elites in distant high lands. Shells from coastal waters appeared in inland ceremonial burials. These exchanges were not merely economic. They carried artistic styles, religious motifs, and technological knowledge. Metallurgy developed in parts of South America, producing gold, silver, and copper works shaped for ritual rather than industrial use. Governance systems varied widely. Some societies organized into empires with bureaucratic hierarchies. Others functioned through federations, councils, or clan networks. Law, diplomacy, and conflict resolution were embedded within cultural frameworks, emphasizing balance, reciprocity, and social cohesion. Education was often oral, history preserved through storytelling, song, and ritual performance. Elders transmitted knowledge across generations, agricultural cycles, medicinal plants, migration histories, cosmology, and ethics. Astronomy shaped architecture across the continents, structures aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and star patterns. Observatories tracked celestial cycles guiding planting seasons and ceremonial calendars. Medicine combined botanical knowledge with spiritual frameworks. Herbal pharmacology addressed wounds, fevers, and infections. Surgical practices, including cranial trepanation in Andean regions, demonstrated anatomical understanding and survival rates that astonish modern researchers. Daily life, beyond monuments and empires, unfolded in rhythms both ordinary and profound. Children learned through observation, farming, weaving, carving, fishing. Textile production reached extraordinary sophistication, particularly in Andean societies where cloth signified status, identity, and political allegiance. Music filled communal gatherings, flutes, drums, rattles, and chants echoing through valleys and forests. Dance reenacted myths and historical events, blending entertainment with memory preservation. Foodways reflected biodiversity. Maize in countless varieties, potatoes cultivated in hundreds of strains, tomatoes, cacao, vanilla, chili peppers, crops that would later transform global cuisine, were already deeply embedded in cultural life. Environmental stewardship guided land use. Crop rotation, polyculture, and seasonal migration prevented ecological exhaustion. Fire management shaped landscapes in North America, promoting biodiversity and hunting grounds. Cities rose and fell over centuries. Droughts, internal conflicts, and environmental shifts influenced migration and political change. Civilizations were not static, they evolved continuously, adapting to pressures much like societies everywhere. By the late 15th century, when European exploration intensified, the Americas held tens of millions of inhabitants, speaking thousands of languages, practicing diverse spiritual traditions, and inhabiting social systems as intricate as any across the ocean. From the Arctic tundra to the Patagonian plains, human presence shaped land and meaning. So when European ships eventually crossed the Atlantic, they did not encounter a blank map. They entered an already peopled hemisphere, one with its own histories of empire, diplomacy, trade, innovation, and imagination. The encounter that followed would reshape all worlds involved, but before sails appeared on the horizon, before maps redrew oceans, before new diseases and animals crossed hemispheres, there existed this vast, thriving human tapestry. A world lit by firelight instead of lantern glass. A world measured in lunar cycles instead of mechanical clocks. A world where stone cities rose from lakes, terraces climbed mountains, and trade routes threaded jungles and deserts alike. And as night settles over this pre-contact landscape, you can imagine the quiet continuity of life. Farmers tending late fields, astronomers watching stars from temple roofs, merchants arriving at dawn markets, families gathered in longhouses or courtyards, unaware that, far beyond the dark curve of the Atlantic, ships were already moving westward, unaware that two worlds, long separated, were slowly drifting toward one another, and that history, like the tide, was beginning to turn. By the closing decades of the 15th century, Europe stood at the edge of a quiet but mounting pressure. Not a single crisis, but a convergence of ambitions, limitations, curiosities, and fears that slowly pushed its kingdoms toward the open ocean. To understand why European ships began turning westward into the Atlantic, it helps to imagine Europe not as a unified force, but as a crowded mosaic of rival kingdoms, trading cities, and rising empires, each seeking advantage in a world where wealth, faith, and power were deeply intertwined. Trade sat at the center of this pressure. For centuries, Europe's connection to the luxuries of Asia had depended on overland and eastern maritime routes collectively known today as the Silk Roads. Along these vast networks moved spices, silks, precious stones, perfumes, ceramics, and rare woods, goods that were not merely decorative but transformative to European daily life. Spices in particular held extraordinary value. Pepper preserved meat through harsh winters. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg flavored food. otherwise limited by seasonal scarcity. Some spices were believed to hold medicinal or even mystical properties, capable of balancing bodily humors or warding illness. But these goods traveled through long chains of intermediaries. Merchants in India sold to Arab traders. Arab traders sold through Ottoman and Venetian networks. By the time spices reached northern Europe, their prices had multiplied many times over. This layered trade system enriched middlemen, while frustrating emerging European powers eager to access wealth more directly. The rise of the Ottoman Empire intensified this tension. When Ottoman forces captured Constantinople in 1453, they gained strategic control over key trade corridors linking Europe to Asia. Trade did not stop, but it became more politically and economically constrained. Tariffs rose. Diplomatic relations complicated access. European kingdoms began to feel dependent on routes they did not control. This dependency stirred both anxiety and imagination. What if Asia could be reached another way? What if ships could bypass intermediaries entirely? The idea was not new. Classical geographers had long speculated about Earth's spherical shape. Mariners knew that traveling far enough in one direction might in theory lead to eastern lands, but theory required ships capable of surviving the attempt. And here, technology began to shift possibility into action. Shipbuilding in the 15th century underwent quiet but meaningful evolution. Iberian shipyards, particularly in Portugal and Spain, refined vessels known as caravels. These ships were smaller than earlier cargo vessels, but far more maneuverable, capable of sailing against wind patterns using lateen, triangular sails. They were not massive floating fortresses. They were agile explorers. Navigation tools improved as well. The magnetic compass, long known but increasingly reliable, allowed sailors to maintain directional bearing, even when coastlines vanished. The astrolabe enabled mariners to estimate latitude by measuring the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon. Portolan charts mapped coastlines with growing accuracy, reflecting accumulated maritime knowledge. Equally important was the understanding of wind systems. Sailors studying Atlantic currents discovered predictable circular wind patterns, trade winds pushing westward near the equator and westerlies carrying ships back east at higher latitudes. This realization made round-trip ocean travel not only possible but strategically navigable. Portugal led early exploration efforts, sending ships down the western coast of Africa in search of gold, trade routes, and eventually a sea path to India. Spain, recently unified through the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, watched closely. Their kingdom had just completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Iberian territories from Muslim rule. This victory shaped Spain's political and religious identity profoundly. Expansion, faith, and monarchy had become intertwined missions. Religious expansion formed another quiet but powerful motivation for westward exploration. Late medieval Europe existed within a deeply Christian framework. Monarchies often saw themselves not only as political rulers, but as defenders and expanders of the faith. Missionary work, conversion, and the spread of Christianity were framed as sacred obligations. Exploration thus carried spiritual undertones alongside economic ones. New lands might mean new souls to convert, new alliances against non-Christian powers, new extensions of Christendom's imagined global reach. This mindset did not always manifest as immediate conquest. Often it appeared in royal charters instructing explorers to spread the faith where possible, blending spiritual rhetoric with imperial ambition. Meanwhile, competition between European powers intensified. Portugal advanced along Africa's coast. Italian city-states dominated Mediterranean trade. England and France consolidated internal power after prolonged conflicts. Spain, newly unified and eager to assert itself, sought its own maritime breakthrough. It was within this atmosphere, economic frustration, technological readiness, religious conviction, and geopolitical rivalry, that proposals for westward voyages gained attention. Among the individuals presenting such proposals was Christopher Columbus. Columbus was not the only navigator imagining westward passage, but he was among the most persistent. Drawing on classical geography, personal calculation, and optimistic underestimation of Earth's circumference, he believed Asia could be reached more quickly by sailing west across the Atlantic. His proposal faced repeated rejection. Portuguese authorities dismissed his distance estimates as flawed. Advisors feared the voyage would be too long for existing provisions and ship durability. Yet persistence mattered. Columbus eventually secured sponsorship from the Spanish crown, not purely out of confidence, but because the potential reward outweighed the investment risk. If he succeeded, Spain might gain direct access to Asian wealth without relying on eastern routes. If he failed, the loss would be limited to ships and supplies. In 1492, 3 vessels, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, departed westward. The voyage itself reflected both courage and uncertainty. Crews sailed into waters largely unknown to European navigation. Weeks passed without landfall. Anxiety grew. Ocean horizons remained unbroken. When land was finally sighted in the Caribbean, Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia, a misunderstanding that would shape early terminology like Indies. What matters in this moment is not the misconception, but the consequence. The voyage demonstrated that sustained westward Atlantic travel was possible. This realization transformed European strategic imagination. Subsequent expeditions followed, Spanish, Portuguese, and eventually others. Some sought Asian routes. Others pursued gold, territory, and trade. Reports returned describing lands rich in resources, inhabited by complex societies, and open in European perception to claim and conversion. Economic motivations deepened quickly. Precious metals, especially silver, would later flow in enormous quantities from American mines into European and global markets. Agricultural products unfamiliar to Europe, tobacco, cacao, maize, entered trade systems. Sugar plantations in Caribbean climates proved extraordinarily profitable, reshaping labor systems and transatlantic commerce. But in the late 15th century, these outcomes were not yet fully visible. What existed instead was anticipation, the sense that westward sailing might unlock wealth comparable to or greater than Eastern trade. Cartography evolved alongside exploration. Maps, once dominated by Mediterranean geography, expanded to include Atlantic islands, coastlines, and eventually continental outlines. Knowledge accumulation became competitive. Kingdoms guarded navigational intelligence as state secrets. Religious framing accompanied many voyages. Expedition documents often included priests or missionaries. Crosses were erected upon landfall. Ceremonies symbolically claimed territory for both crown and church. Yet the daily reality of sailors remained grounded in survival. Rationing food, navigating storms, repairing sails, and interpreting unfamiliar currents. Technological progress did not eliminate fear. It merely made risk calculable. The Atlantic itself shaped exploration psychology. Unlike Mediterranean sailing, Atlantic voyages lost sight of land for extended periods. Mariners relied on stars, instruments, and trust in wind systems. The ocean became both pathway and psychological threshold. Vast, unpredictable, and humbling. As more voyages succeeded, confidence replaced hesitation. Spain and Portugal formalized territorial claims through diplomatic agreements like the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing newly encountered lands along longitudinal lines, an act reflecting how exploration had already become imperial competition. Other European powers observed closely. England, France, and the Netherlands would later enter Atlantic exploration, motivated by the same pressures: trade access, wealth acquisition, religious expansion, and geopolitical rivalry. Technological innovation continued refining maritime capacity. Larger carracks transported cargo and settlers. Gunpowder weaponry enhanced naval conflict capability. Navigation schools institutionalized knowledge training. Exploration shifted gradually into colonization. But at its origin, the movement westward began less as conquest and more as calculated experiment, an attempt to solve Europe's trade limitations through geography. Economic desire remained central. Spices still motivated exploration long after initial voyages. The dream of reaching Asia directly persisted, even as the Americas emerged as destinations themselves. Religious narratives adapted accordingly. Conversion efforts expanded into missionary networks across newly contacted regions. Faith, empire, and economy braided into a single expansionist framework. Yet it is important to hold the tone of this era not as inevitable domination, but as unfolding uncertainty. No European sailor in the 1480s could fully imagine the demographic, ecological, and geopolitical transformations that Atlantic crossings would unleash. They operated within immediate motivations: prestige for crowns, salvation for souls, curiosity for navigators, Each voyage layered new knowledge onto old maps. Each return reshaped European perception of world scale. Gradually, the Atlantic transformed from feared boundary into commercial corridor, a liquid highway connecting continents previously isolated for millennia. Shipyards expanded production. Ports like Seville and Lisbon thrived as imperial gateways. Merchant classes accumulated wealth through transoceanic trade. The desire that had once focused on spices alone broadened into land, labor, metals, and agricultural systems. And beneath all these motivations remained competition. No kingdom wished to fall behind another in securing routes, resources, or converts. Exploration became both opportunity and obligation within European power politics. So when we look back at Europe's motivation to sail west, we see not a single cause but a convergence, trade routes constrained by intermediaries, spice wealth inflating beyond reach, religious zeal seeking new frontiers, technological innovation enabling longer voyages, imperial rivalry accelerating risk-taking, and individuals, navigators, monarchs, merchants willing to test ocean horizons in pursuit of advantage. The Atlantic did not call to Europe with a single voice. It whispered through markets burdened by spice prices, through priests envisioning global Christendom, through shipwrights refining hull designs, through maps with blank western edges, through sailors wondering what lay beyond the curve of water. And slowly, ship by ship, sail by sail, Europe began to answer that whisper, turning westward into an ocean that would, in time, bind continents into a shared and irreversible history. For centuries, the Atlantic Ocean had been imagined by many Europeans as a vast and uncertain expanse, a stretch of water marking the outer edge of the known world. Coastal fishing vessels ventured into it, traders navigated parts of it, but the idea of crossing it deliberately and returning reliably required more than courage. It required systems. It required understanding. It required ships built not just to float, but to endure distance. The transformation of the Atlantic from a psychological barrier into a navigable corridor did not happen suddenly. It unfolded through incremental improvements in ship design, navigational instruments, accumulated maritime knowledge, and careful observation of wind and current patterns. What had once been a daunting edge gradually became a structured pathway. Shipbuilding stood at the center of this shift. Medieval European vessels had been largely designed for coastal trade or Mediterranean conditions. They relied heavily on square sails, which worked efficiently when wind blew from behind, but limited maneuverability when wind shifted direction. Hull designs prioritized cargo volume over agility. These ships were functional within enclosed seas, but the open Atlantic demanded something different. In the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in Portugal, shipbuilders began refining a vessel that would become critical to long-distance exploration: the caravel. The caravel was smaller than many cargo ships of its time, but its design prioritized adaptability. It featured a relatively light hull and shallow draft, allowing it to navigate coastal waters and estuaries with flexibility. More importantly, many caravels were equipped with lateen sails, triangular sails mounted on long yards at an angle to the mast. The lateen sail was transformative. Unlike square sails, it allowed ships to tack against the wind, meaning they could zigzag forward even when winds blew from the direction they wished to travel. This capability proved essential in unpredictable Atlantic conditions. Caravels were not large enough to carry vast cargoes or armies. They were, instead, exploratory tools. Ships built to gather information, chart coastlines, and test routes. Their size made them more manageable for smaller crews, reducing supply requirements while increasing navigational control. As voyages grew longer and ambitions expanded, shipbuilders also developed larger vessels such as the carrack. Carracks combined cargo capacity with ocean endurance. They featured multiple decks, higher forecastles and stern castles for stability, and a mix of square and lateen sails for balanced performance. These ships could carry provisions for months at sea. They could transport trade goods, settlers, animals, and equipment. Their reinforced hulls were designed to withstand Atlantic swells that dwarfed Mediterranean waves. Hull construction itself improved over time. Stronger framing methods, more durable timber selection, and better caulking techniques reduced leakage and structural weakness. Iron nails and improved joinery strengthened seams. Shipwrights learned from experience. Storms revealed design flaws, and repairs informed future builds. Equally important as the ships themselves were the tools used to navigate them. In earlier centuries, mariners relied primarily on coastal landmarks and accumulated experience. The Atlantic required open ocean navigation, where land might remain unseen. For weeks, the magnetic compass became an essential instrument. Although known in Europe since at least the 12th century, its refinement allowed sailors to maintain consistent directional bearings even when skies were overcast. The compass did not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced dependence on visible celestial markers. The astrolabe represented another critical development. Adapted from earlier Islamic and classical designs, the mariner's astrolabe allowed sailors to measure the angle of the sun at noon or the North Star at night. From these measurements, they could estimate latitude, their position north or south of the equator. While longitude remained far more difficult to calculate accurately at sea during this period, latitude measurement alone allowed mariners to follow consistent east-west lines once they reached a desired north-south position. Dead reckoning supplemented instrument readings. Sailors estimated distance traveled by measuring speed with a log line, a rope knotted at regular intervals and cast into the water. By counting knots passing over a fixed time, they estimated velocity. Combined with compass direction and time, this method provided approximate positional tracking. Navigation also relied heavily on portaland charts, detailed coastal maps that recorded harbors, hazards, and compass bearings. Though initially Mediterranean-focused, these charts expanded as Atlantic coastlines were explored and documented. Knowledge accumulated slowly but steadily. Each voyage returned with observations, water temperatures, wind directions, currents, seasonal storm patterns. Mariners shared information within royal courts, merchant guilds, and naval circles. Over time, the Atlantic began to feel less like a void and more like a system governed by patterns. Wind patterns, in particular, proved decisive. Sailors gradually recognized the reliability of trade winds near the equator, steady easterly winds that pushed ships westward. These winds enabled relatively swift crossings from Europe to the Caribbean once their behavior was understood. Equally important were the westerlies farther north. Ships returning eastward learned to sail north into these wind belts before turning back toward Europe. This circular route, known as the Volta do Mar, or turn of the sea, allowed for predictable round trips, rather than fighting prevailing winds directly. Sailors adapted to them. The Atlantic revealed itself as a rotating system, currents and winds forming broad gyres that could be harnessed rather than resisted. This understanding transformed navigation from guesswork into strategic routing. Ocean currents reinforced these wind systems. The Canary Current flowed southward along the coast of Africa. The North Equatorial Current moved westward toward the Caribbean. The Gulf Stream carried warm water northeastward across the Atlantic toward Europe. By aligning voyages with these currents, ships conserved energy and reduced travel time. Regular crossings became possible not because the ocean changed, but because human understanding of its rhythms deepened. Logistics played a crucial role as well. Long voyages required food preservation strategies. Salted meat, hardtack, a durable biscuit, dried legumes, and barrels of fresh water formed standard provisions. Ships carried live animals for slaughter en route when possible. Storage techniques minimized spoilage within the limits of the era's knowledge. Crew management also mattered. Ships operated with structured hierarchies. Captains, pilots, boatswains, carpenters, cooks, and sailors each assigned defined roles. Discipline maintained operational stability during long stretches without landfall. Maintenance occurred continuously at sea. Sail repairs, hull inspections, rope replacement, and pump operation required coordinated labor. The ability to address damage mid-voyage improved survival rates. Port infrastructure expanded alongside maritime capacity. Harbors like Lisbon, Seville, and later Cadiz developed facilities for ship construction, supply storage, and navigation training. Bureaucracies formed to oversee maritime expansion, documenting routes, recording discoveries, and regulating trade. Navigation schools institutionalized knowledge transfer. Portugal's maritime initiatives under Prince Henry the Navigator fostered systematic exploration along Africa's coast. Though often romanticized, these efforts were fundamentally logistical, charting coastlines, incrementally building relationships with trading partners, and refining sailing techniques. Experience replaced speculation. Storms remained unpredictable, but seasonal patterns became recognizable. Hurricane seasons in the Caribbean were eventually understood and factored into departure timing. The Atlantic scale did not shrink, but it became calculable. Distance estimates improved, even if imperfectly. Crossing times could be predicted within approximate ranges. Supply quantities could be planned with greater accuracy. Risk persisted, but it became manageable risk. Insurance systems emerged in some maritime centers, distributing financial exposure among investors. Exploration was no longer purely personal gamble. It became organized enterprise. Communication networks expanded accordingly. Letters and reports traveled between colonies in Europe, though slowly. Information about safe harbors, hostile coastlines, and profitable trade goods accumulated into navigational intelligence. Ship armament evolved too, though primarily for defense. Cannons mounted on decks deterred piracy and protected cargo. Their presence reflected not drama, but precaution. By the early 16th century, Atlantic crossings were no longer extraordinary events requiring singular justification. They became components of scheduled trade circuits. Fleets departed in coordinated convoys to reduce vulnerability. Treasure fleets transported silver and goods under naval escort, timetables aligned with wind seasons. This routinization marked a fundamental transformation. The Atlantic shifted from frontier to infrastructure. Ship design continued to adapt. Galleons combined cargo capacity with streamlined hull shapes. For improved speed, rigging configurations optimized balance between square and lateen sails, providing both downwind efficiency and maneuverability. Advancements were incremental, refined through repetition rather than innovation leaps. Even crew knowledge evolved generationally. Seafaring families passed down practical skills. Pilots trained apprentices. Experience navigating specific routes became valued expertise. Maritime language standardized procedures. Commands were codified. Measurement systems aligned. The Atlantic's vastness remained constant, but its unpredictability diminished in perception. Regular crossings enabled sustained settlement patterns. Supplies could be replenished. Officials could rotate between continents. Trade cycles synchronized with agricultural harvests. Weather forecasting remained rudimentary, yet observation records grew. Mariners learned to read cloud formations, sea color changes, and wind shifts as indicators of approaching systems. Lighthouses and navigational markers improved coastal entry. Soundings measured water depth near shorelines, preventing groundings. Every improvement reduced friction. Not entirely. Shipwrecks still occurred. Storms still overwhelmed vessels. But the frequency of successful voyages increased. The Atlantic ceased to be imagined as an abyss separating worlds. It became a corridor, wide, powerful, demanding respect, but navigable through knowledge and preparation. Logistics dominated this transformation more than heroism. Timber supply chains ensured ship production continuity. Rope-making industries expanded to meet rigging needs. Sailcloth weaving became specialized craft. Maritime economies flourished inland as well. Iron for nails, tar for sealing hulls, food production for provisioning fleets. Exploration was never purely nautical. It was industrial, administrative, and agricultural. Wind patterns, once feared as chaotic, became reliable allies. Sailors departed Iberia knowing that if they followed southern routes, trade winds would carry them west. They understood that returning required northward arcs to catch westerlies home. This circular logic structured empire. Routes defined schedules. Schedules defined markets. Markets defined policy. The Atlantic did not shrink in physical size, but it compressed in psychological scale. Its crossing became a matter of weeks rather than mythical distance. And in that compression lay enormous consequence. When pathways stabilize, exchange accelerates. Goods, people, plants, animals, and ideas began moving along these routes with increasing regularity. The Atlantic's logistical mastery enabled transformations far beyond maritime innovation. But at its foundation, the shift began with shipwrights adjusting hull curvature, with sailors measuring stars, with navigators studying wind belts. The ocean was not conquered. It was learned, its patterns observed, its currents charted, its winds respected. Gradually, deliberately, the Atlantic became less a barrier dividing continents and more a structured artery connecting them. And through that artery, history began to flow in both directions, carried not by drama alone, but by timber, rope, sail, compass and wind, long before armies could march inland, before colonial administrations could organize territory, before languages or religions could take root in unfamiliar soil. An invisible force had already begun reshaping the balance between Europe and the Americas. It traveled silently, without banners or declarations, carried in breath, blood, clothing, and proximity. Disease, unintended, unseen, and often poorly understood even by those who carried it, would become one of the most decisive factors in the transformation that followed transatlantic contact. To understand its impact, it helps first to imagine two hemispheres that had lived in biological separation for thousands of years. Human populations had migrated into the Americas during prehistoric eras, crossing land bridges that once connected Siberia and Alaska. Over generations, these populations spread across continents, forming diverse societies adapted to local environments. Yet once sea levels rose and continents separated, regular biological exchange between the eastern and western hemispheres largely ceased. In Eurasia and Africa, dense populations lived alongside domesticated animals, cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, sheep, and goats. These close relationships allowed diseases to evolve and circulate between species. Illnesses like smallpox, measles, influenza, and others emerged from this long ecological interaction. Over centuries, repeated exposure shaped partial immunities within Old World populations. Epidemics still occurred, often devastatingly, but survivors passed down genetic resistance and immunological familiarity. In the Americas, the ecological context differed. While domesticated animals existed, llamas, alpacas, turkeys, guinea pigs, the scale and proximity of animal husbandry did not mirror Eurasian patterns. Large urban populations did exist in parts of the Americas, but the disease pool circulating within them was comparatively narrower. As a result, many Old World pathogens had never been encountered in the Western Hemisphere. When transatlantic voyages began linking continents after 1492, biological isolation ended abruptly. Ships did not carry only sailors and supplies. They carried microbes within lungs, on skin, in textiles, and livestock and food stores. No one aboard understood germ theory. The mechanisms of contagion remained centuries from scientific articulation. Transmission occurred through ordinary contact. An infected sailor might cough in a coastal settlement. A blanket handled by traders might carry viral particles. A domesticated animal introduced to a new environment might host unfamiliar pathogens. Initial outbreaks often appeared as sudden fevers, rashes, respiratory distress, or weakness. Symptoms interpreted through local medical and spiritual frameworks. Smallpox became one of the most consequential diseases in this exchange. It spread through respiratory droplets and close contact, producing fever and characteristic skin eruptions. Among populations without prior exposure, mortality rates could be extraordinarily high. Survivors gained immunity, but the first waves encountered communities entirely immunologically unprepared. Outbreaks did not remain confined to coastal contact zones. Trade networks, migration routes, and diplomatic travel carried pathogens inland faster than Europeans themselves could move. Disease often preceded conquest geographically. A trading delegation might unknowingly transport infection into distant cities. Messengers moving between allied communities could spread illness across vast regions. In some recorded cases, epidemics reached major population centers before direct European arrival, destabilizing societies in advance of military encounters. Demographic impact varied regionally, but was frequently profound. Communities lost elders who held oral histories and governance knowledge. Farmers fell ill during planting or harvest cycles, disrupting food production. Artisans, healers, and leaders disappeared within compressed timeframes. Social cohesion strained under repeated waves of mortality. Medical responses reflected cultural frameworks. Herbal treatments, sweat lodges, isolation practices, and spiritual ceremonies were employed to combat illness. Some approaches may have offered symptomatic relief or limited containment, but without prior exposure, population-level immunity remained absent. It is essential to emphasize that disease did not function as an intentional weapon in most early encounters. Transmission occurred unintentionally, carried by individuals unaware they were vectors. Germ theory would not emerge until the 19th century. Neither Europeans nor indigenous populations understood microbial causation. Nevertheless, The epidemiological consequences shaped geopolitical outcomes. When European expeditions entered regions already weakened by epidemics, they encountered societies facing demographic shock. Military resistance still occurred, often fiercely, but population loss altered strategic capacity. Labor systems faltered. Agricultural terraces went untended. Irrigation networks deteriorated without maintenance. Food shortages compounded vulnerability. Political structures destabilized. Succession crises emerged when rulers died without clear heirs. Diplomatic alliances fractured as communities struggled to respond collectively. Psychological effects accompanied biological ones. Unfamiliar diseases challenged cosmological understandings. Some communities interpreted epidemics through spiritual frameworks, as omens, curses, or divine imbalance, shaping responses to European presence in varied ways. It would be inaccurate to portray disease as acting alone. European expansion relied on technology, alliances, military strategy, and economic systems. Yet disease functioned as a force multiplier, accelerating transformations that might otherwise have unfolded differently or more slowly. Smallpox was not the only pathogen involved. Measles, influenza, typhus, and other illnesses followed similar transmission pathways. Each wave encountered populations with little prior exposure. Epidemics often occurred sequentially rather than singularly. A community weakened by one outbreak might face another within years. Compounding demographic impact. Recovery required generational time, while colonial systems advanced within decades. The biological exchange was not entirely one-directional. Syphilis, for example, is believed by many historians to have led from the Americas to Europe, where it spread rapidly in late 15th century populations. This reciprocal transmission underscores that disease exchange affected both hemispheres, though demographic consequences were asymmetrical. Environmental transformation also influenced epidemiology. European livestock introduced new vectors. Deforestation altered mosquito habitats. Settlement patterns changed disease ecology across regions. Yet the initial imbalance stemmed from immunological history. Centuries of pathogen exposure in one hemisphere contrasted with relative isolation in the other. Documentation from European observers sometimes noted epidemic impact with a mixture of fear, misunderstanding, and opportunism. Some saw depopulated regions as easier to settle. Others feared contagion themselves, recognizing disease as unpredictable and indiscriminate. Missionaries and colonial administrators occasionally attempted rudimentary quarantine practices, though effectiveness varied. Indigenous responses evolved over time. Communities developed adaptive strategies, relocating settlements, modifying trade contact, caring for survivors, preserving knowledge through alternative means. Resilience coexisted with loss. It is important, in a calm historical tone, to avoid framing disease impact as inevitability or justification. Epidemics were biological events shaped by contact, ecology, and immunology, not moral verdicts or civilizational measures. They altered balance, but they did not erase agency. Indigenous societies continued resisting, negotiating, adapting, and surviving despite epidemiological catastrophe. From a logistical perspective, disease influenced colonization patterns. European settlements sometimes expanded into areas where population decline created perceived land availability. Labor shortages contributed to the rise of transatlantic slavery systems, as colonial economies sought alternative workforces. Thus, disease intertwined with economic and social transformations far beyond initial outbreaks. Medical understanding remained limited for centuries. Preventative inoculation against smallpox would not become widespread until the 18th century. Earlier, survival depended largely on chance exposure and immune response. As colonial societies stabilized, mixed populations gradually developed shared disease environments. Immunological landscapes shifted through intermarriage, exposure, and generational adaptation. But the early contact period remained defined by asymmetry. Disease traveled faster than diplomacy. It moved without negotiation, without translation barriers, without geographic awareness. A single infected individual could initiate transmission chains extending hundreds of miles through trade and kinship networks. From a systems perspective, disease functioned as an accelerant within a larger process of global integration, part of what historians call the Columbian exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, people, and pathogens between hemispheres. This exchange reshaped agriculture, cuisine, ecology, and demography worldwide. Potatoes and maize traveled eastward, transforming European diets. Horses traveled westward, reshaping mobility in the Americas. Pathogens moved in both directions, though with unequal demographic impact. The power of disease lay in its invisibility. Armies could be counted. Ships could be tracked. Weapons could be resisted. Microbes moved beyond sensory detection. They did not require infrastructure. They required only contact. Their spread followed human pathways, trade routes, family networks, ceremonial gatherings, refugee migrations. By the time symptoms appeared, transmission had often already advanced. From a calm, analytical lens, disease reveals how biological systems intersect with historical trajectories. European expansion was not driven solely by intention or superiority. It was shaped by ecological happenstance, the collision of long-separated disease environments. This collision produced outcomes no participant fully anticipated or understood, and yet its consequences became foundational to the reshaping of the Atlantic world. Population decline in some regions reached staggering proportions over decades. Cultural continuity faced immense strain. Knowledge transmission fractured under generational loss. Still, survival persisted. Communities rebuilt. Traditions adapted. Languages endured. Resistance movements emerged even in epidemiologically weakened societies. The story of disease in this era is not solely one of devastation, but of imbalance, a biological asymmetry that altered the pace and structure of encounter. It reminds us that history does not unfold only through visible decisions, treaties, battles, voyages, but also through microscopic processes operating beyond contemporary awareness. As ships crossed the Atlantic more regularly, disease exchange stabilized somewhat. Immunities developed gradually. Epidemic cycles became less catastrophic, though never absent. But in those early decades of contact, when continents met after millennia apart, disease moved ahead of empire, reshaping landscapes before maps could be redrawn. Quietly, unintentionally, decisively, an invisible current within the larger tide of global connection. When European expeditions first arrived in the Americas, their numbers were often far smaller than later historical imagination suggests. Ships carried limited crews. Even large expeditions rarely numbered more than a few hundred soldiers. Against vast empires and densely populated regions, such forces alone could not have reshaped political landscapes. Military strength alone. What made expansion possible in many early cases was not numerical dominance, but the complex web of alliances, rivalries, grievances, and diplomatic negotiations that already existed within indigenous worlds. To understand this dynamic, it is necessary to step away from simplified narratives of unilateral conquest and instead enter a political environment already structured by competition, tribute systems, regional conflicts, and shifting power balances. Across Mesoamerica and the Andes, empires had expanded through their own processes of warfare and alliance building, long before European arrival. Subjugated regions paid tribute, rival polities resisted imperial authority, border territories negotiated autonomy through diplomacy or conflict. European expeditions entered these systems as new actors, small in number, technologically unfamiliar, and initially dependent on local interpretation to survive. Communication formed the first layer of dependence. European explorers did not speak indigenous languages upon arrival. They relied on interpreters, sometimes captured, sometimes allied, to translate negotiations. Through these intermediaries, Europeans learned about regional politics, which groups resented imperial centers, which cities resisted tribute, which leaders sought advantage against rivals. One of the most cited examples of this dynamic occurred during the expedition led by Hernán Cortés in the early 16th century. When Cortés arrived along the Gulf Coast of present-day Mexico, his force numbered only a few hundred soldiers. They possessed firearms, steel weapons, and horses, technologies unfamiliar in the region, but they remained vastly outnumbered by the populations of the Mexica, Aztec Empire, and its tributary territories. Rather than advancing alone, Cortés engaged diplomatically with local polities. Some coastal communities initially resisted. Others, resentful of Mexica tribute demands, saw opportunity in aligning with newcomers. Among the most consequential alliances formed was with the Tlaxcalans, a confederation of city-states that had long resisted Mexican domination. The Tlaxcalans were formidable warriors in their own right. Their conflict with the Mexica predated European arrival by generations. Tribute wars, territorial disputes, and ritualized conflict had shaped regional politics deeply. After initial battles between Cortes's forces and Tlaxcalan armies, diplomacy prevailed. Mutual interest in opposing Mexican power led to alliance. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors joined Spanish campaigns, providing logistical support, battlefield numbers, and regional knowledge. This alliance transformed the scale of Cortes's expedition. What began as a small European force evolved into a coalition army composed largely of indigenous fighters, pursuing their own strategic goals. For many allies, the objective was not to empower Europeans but to weaken Mexican hegemony. As campaigns moved inland toward Tenochtitlan, additional allies joined, each motivated by local grievances or political calculation. The coalition nature of these forces complicates simplistic conquest narratives. Indigenous allies provided intelligence on terrain, supply routes, and political factions. They carried provisions, constructed siege equipment, and reinforced military ranks. Without such alliances, European forces alone would likely have lacked the manpower to sustain prolonged campaigns deep within imperial territory. A similar pattern unfolded in the Andean region during the expedition led by Francisco Pizarro. When Pizarro's forces entered the Inca sphere in the 1530s, they encountered an empire already destabilized by internal conflict. A civil war between rival claimants to imperial authority, commonly associated with the brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar, had fragmented political unity. This internal struggle weakened centralized command structures and strained military cohesion. Regional leaders navigated uncertain loyalties amid shifting power claims. Pizarro's expedition, like Cortes's, was numerically small, fewer than 200 soldiers during critical encounters, yet they leveraged diplomatic engagement with factions disaffected by imperial rule or aligned against rival claimants. Some local groups resentful of Inca labor taxation or administrative control saw opportunity in collaborating with outsiders who might alter the political order. Others sought to preserve autonomy by negotiating alliance rather than resisting alone. As in Mesoamerica, indigenous allies provided logistical infrastructure, porters, translators, guides, and supplementary fighters. Mountain terrain required specialized knowledge. European forces depended heavily on local navigation expertise to traverse Andean roads and passes. The capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca is often cited as a pivotal moment, but its broader context includes the fractured political landscape surrounding it. Imperial authority had already been strained by civil war, disease outbreaks, and regional dissent. Following initial encounters, Spanish expeditions expanded alliances further, incorporating indigenous auxiliaries into campaigns against remaining imperial strongholds. These alliances were rarely permanent or unconditional. They were shaped by negotiation, mistrust, shifting incentives, and evolving perceptions of European intentions. Some allied groups later resisted Spanish authority once colonial systems replaced imperial ones. Diplomacy functioned as an ongoing process rather than a single agreement. Gift exchanges, marriage alliances, tribute negotiations, and ceremonial recognition all played roles in alliance building. Europeans adapted to indigenous diplomatic customs, sometimes imperfectly, learning protocols through intermediaries. Religion occasionally intersected with alliance structures as well. Missionaries traveled alongside expeditions, and conversion efforts sometimes accompanied political negotiation, though outcomes varied widely. It is important to recognize that indigenous polities exercised agency throughout these processes. Alliances were strategic decisions, not passive submissions. Leaders assessed risks, benefits, and long-term implications within the limits of available information. From their perspective, Europeans represented one more potential ally or threat within an already complex geopolitical landscape. Military technology influenced alliance dynamics but did not replace them. Firearms, cavalry, and steel weapons provided tactical advantages, particularly in psychological impact during early encounters. Yet firearms were slow to reload, horses required care, and ammunition supplies were limited. Sustained campaigns still depended on numbers, provisioning, and local support. Resources indigenous allies supplied in far greater proportion than European troops themselves. Logistics again proved decisive. Allied communities provided food, shelter, and supply lines. They constructed boats, bridges, and siege platforms when needed. Without such infrastructure, European expeditions would have struggled to maintain operational continuity far from coastal bases. Intelligence networks also emerged through alliances. Messengers relayed information about enemy movements, terrain hazards, and political developments. Knowledge flowed multidirectionally, Europeans learning regional geography, while allies learned European military capabilities. Rivalries between indigenous polities often predated imperial expansion itself. City-states competed for trade dominance. Border communities disputed resources. Tribute relationships bred resentment over time. European arrival did not create these rivalries. It intersected with them. In some cases, alliances were formed cautiously, with communities waiting to see whether Europeans would honor agreements or impose control. In others, rapid alignment occurred where grievances were acute. The fall of major imperial centers did not end alliance politics. Post-conquest governance relied on existing indigenous administrative systems. Local elites sometimes retained authority under colonial oversight, facilitating tax collection and labor organization. This continuity underscores how European expansion often layered itself atop pre-existing political structures, rather than replacing them instantly. Resistance also emerged within alliance networks. Some indigenous groups refused cooperation from the outset. Others shifted allegiance when colonial demands intensified. Rebellions, uprisings, and defensive coalitions persisted throughout the colonial period, reflecting ongoing negotiation of power rather than unilateral domination. Historical documentation often privileges European written accounts, which can obscure the scale of indigenous participation in military campaigns. Archaeological evidence, indigenous oral histories, and demographic analysis reveal coalition armies numbering in the tens of thousands, the vast majority indigenous. This reframing emphasizes that conquest was not executed by Europeans alone, but through entangled alliances shaped by regional politics. Disease, as discussed earlier, intersected with these dynamics as well. Epidemics weakened some polities while sparing others temporarily, shifting alliance incentives and military capacity unevenly. Geography further influenced alliance formation. Mountain communities might resist lowland empires. Coastal traders might align with newcomers to preserve commerce. Frontier regions often navigated multiple power centers simultaneously. European leaders learned quickly that diplomacy could achieve outcomes unattainable through force alone. They adopted negotiation strategies, offering military support against rivals, promising reduced tribute, or recognizing local autonomy in exchange for allegiance. Some promises were honored. Others were later renegotiated or broken as colonial systems consolidated authority. From a logistical perspective, alliances solved immediate operational challenges for Europeans. They extended supply chains. They provided environmental knowledge. They facilitated translation. They legitimized political presence within local frameworks. Without these functions, small expeditionary forces would have remained isolated, coastal visitors rather than inland actors. Over time, however, alliance dynamics shifted as colonial administrations formalized governance. Indigenous allies often found themselves subject to new tribute systems, labor demands, and religious oversight, conditions that sometimes mirrored or exceeded prior imperial obligations. This shift led to re-evaluation of earlier alliances, and in some cases resistance movements, seeking to renegotiate or expel colonial authority. The story of alliances and rivalries, therefore, is not static. It begins with strategic cooperation, but evolves into layered relationships shaped by power asymmetry, adaptation, and contestation. What remains consistent is the recognition that European expansion was not executed in a political vacuum. It unfolded within already sophisticated diplomatic landscapes. Indigenous leaders assessed European arrivals through pragmatic lenses, potential partners, potential threats, potential tools within regional power struggles. Europeans, for their part, depended on these alliances to survive and advance. Their numbers were small, their geographical knowledge limited, their logistical infrastructure incomplete. Alliance building transformed vulnerability into capability. Through interpreters, gifts, negotiations, and shared campaigns, coalitions formed that reshaped continental power structures, not through unilateral force, but through entangled interests. And within those entanglements, lay one of the most decisive yet often misunderstood mechanisms of early European expansion in the Americas: the power of existing rivalries and the alliances forged within them. As European voyages extended across the Atlantic and contact with the Americas deepened, expansion was rarely framed in purely economic or political language alone. Alongside ambitions for trade, territory, and prestige traveled a powerful ideological framework: religion. For many European monarchies, especially those of the Iberian Peninsula, exploration and colonization were not only material enterprises, but spiritual ones, understood through the lens of Christian duty, salvation, and divine mandate. To understand the role religion played in justifying expansion, it helps to return to the cultural atmosphere of late 15th and early 16th century Europe. Christianity was not merely a personal belief system; it structured governance, law, education, diplomacy, and identity. Monarchs ruled in theory by divine sanction. Wars were framed as struggles between faiths. Conversion was viewed as a moral good, an act believed to save souls from eternal loss. In this worldview, geographic expansion and spiritual expansion often became intertwined. When European ships reached the Americas, they did not arrive only with soldiers and traders. They carried clergy, priests, friars, and missionaries tasked with spreading Christian teachings among newly encountered populations. Conversion efforts became embedded in colonial frameworks from the earliest decades of contact. The Spanish crown in particular saw religious expansion as integral to imperial legitimacy. Following the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Iberian territories from Muslim rule, Spain emerged with a strengthened sense of religious mission. The monarchy had positioned itself as defender and promoter of Catholic Christianity. This identity extended outward as Spain sponsored overseas expeditions. Papal authority reinforced this framing. Through a series of papal bulls in the late 15th century, the Catholic Church granted Spain and Portugal rights to explore and claim newly encountered lands, with the stipulation that they spread Christianity among indigenous populations. These documents did not merely authorize territorial claims, they sacralized them. Expansion became morally framed as evangelization. Within this structure, the Spanish crown operated under what historians call the Patronato Real, a system granting the monarchy significant authority over church affairs in colonial territories. The crown funded missionary work, appointed ecclesiastical officials, and oversaw the establishment of churches, monasteries, and dioceses across the Americas. This arrangement bound church and state closely together. Missionary orders played central roles in conversion campaigns. Among the most prominent were the Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and later the Jesuits. Each order brought its own philosophy, methods, and organizational structures, yet all shared the goal of evangelization. Missionaries often traveled ahead of or alongside colonial administrators. They established missions, religious communities designed to teach Christian doctrine, administer sacraments, and reorganize daily life around European religious norms. These missions sometimes included schools, agricultural training, and craft instruction alongside catechism. Conversion efforts varied in method and intensity. Some missionaries pursued gradual engagement, learning indigenous languages, translating prayers and scripture, and adapting teaching strategies to local cultural frameworks. Others favored more directive approaches, encouraging the abandonment of pre-existing spiritual practices. Language acquisition became a crucial tool of evangelization. Missionaries compiled dictionaries, grammars, and translated religious texts into indigenous languages. This linguistic work, while rooted in conversion aims, also preserved valuable records of indigenous speech and oral tradition. Baptism served as the formal entry point into Christian identity. Mass baptisms occurred in some regions, especially where missionaries believed rapid conversion necessary. In other areas, instruction preceded baptism, with catechumens receiving doctrinal education before sacramental initiation. Religious architecture followed missionary presence. Churches, chapels, and monasteries rose in colonial towns and mission settlements. These structures often blended European architectural forms with indigenous labor and artistry, creating hybrid visual landscapes. Festivals and ritual calendars were introduced or adapted. Christian holy days, sometimes aligned with existing seasonal celebrations, facilitating cultural transition while embedding new religious meanings. From the perspective of the Spanish crown, evangelization provided moral justification for colonial governance. If expansion served to bring Christianity to new populations, it could be framed not as exploitation but as spiritual stewardship. This framing appeared in legal documents, royal decrees, and theological debates. One such document, known historically as the Requerimiento, was read, often in Spanish, to indigenous communities upon Spanish arrival. It outlined Christian cosmology, papal authority, and Spain's divine right to claim territory. Acceptance would ensure peaceful relations. Refusal could justify conflict. In practice, the document's communication effectiveness was limited by language barriers and contextual incomprehension. Yet its existence reveals how legal and religious rationales intertwined. Missionaries themselves did not always align uniformly with colonial authorities. Some clergy became vocal critics of colonial abuses. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas argued for indigenous rights, condemning forced labor systems, and advocating more humane conversion methods. Debates within Spain and the Church reflected moral tensions surrounding expansion. The Valladolid debate in the mid-16th century, for instance, examined whether indigenous peoples possessed rational souls and thus deserved ethical treatment under Christian doctrine. While outcomes remained complex, such debates illustrate that religious justification was contested, not monolithic. Mission systems reshaped indigenous daily life in multiple dimensions. Settlements were reorganized around churches and plazas. Agricultural production sometimes shifted to support mission economies. Education introduced European literacy, crafts, and religious instruction. Children often became focal points of missionary efforts. Teaching younger generations was viewed as more effective for long-term conversion. Schools attached to missions provided catechism, language instruction, and vocational training. Music and art played roles in evangelization as well. Missionaries incorporated choirs, religious paintings, sculptures, and theatrical performances to communicate Christian narratives visually and orally. Indigenous artisans contributed significantly to this cultural synthesis, producing devotional works blending local and European aesthetics. Conversion did not always mean total abandonment of prior beliefs. Syncretism, the blending of religious traditions, emerged widely. Indigenous cosmologies sometimes merged with Christian symbolism, producing hybrid spiritual practices that persisted beneath or alongside official doctrine. From an administrative standpoint, the Spanish crown viewed successful conversion as stabilizing colonial rule. Christianized populations could be integrated into parish systems, taxed through ecclesiastical structures, and governed through moral frameworks aligned with European law. The Church also functioned as a record-keeping institution. Baptismal, marriage, and burial records documented population demographics, facilitating colonial administration. Economic systems intersected with religious institutions as well. Missions often operated agricultural estates, workshops, and trade networks supporting clergy and converts alike. Some became economically self-sustaining communities. Jesuit missions in particular developed extensive settlement networks in parts of South America, organizing indigenous labor within mission economies, while providing education and religious instruction. Not all indigenous communities accepted missionary presence, maintaining spiritual traditions despite colonial pressure. Others negotiated partial accommodation, adopting certain practices while preserving core cosmologies. Geographic remoteness sometimes limited missionary reach, allowing spiritual continuity in less accessible regions. Over time, religious conversion became both genuine spiritual transformation for some individuals and a pragmatic adaptation for others. Navigating colonial systems, it is important to maintain a calm, factual tone when examining religious justification. From the European perspective of the era, evangelization was often viewed sincerely as benevolent, a mission to save souls and extend divine truth. From indigenous perspectives, it could represent cultural disruption, spiritual displacement, or negotiated coexistence. Both interpretations coexisted within historical reality. The Spanish crown's alliance with church institutionalized religious expansion structurally. Colonial cities were organized around cathedrals. Bishops administered dioceses paralleling civil jurisdictions. Monastic orders received land grants to establish missions. Religious authority reinforced political authority. Sermons could promote loyalty to the crown. Confession could gather social knowledge. Festivals could reinforce colonial identity. Yet clergy also mediated conflicts. Missionaries sometimes advocated for indigenous communities against exploitative settlers, invoking Christian ethics to restrain abuses. Thus, religion functioned simultaneously as justification, governance tool, cultural bridge, and moral battleground. Education systems reinforced Christian frameworks across generations. Literacy training often centered on religious texts. Doctrine shaped moral law. European cosmology entered indigenous intellectual life through mission schooling. Conversion campaigns extended beyond initial contact, centuries into colonial rule. New missions pushed into frontier regions. Clergy accompanied expeditions deeper inland. Evangelization remained a continuous process rather than a completed milestone. The moral framing of expansion persisted in European discourse. Colonial wealth extraction could be defended as enabling missionary work. Territorial control could be framed as protecting converts from rival empires or spiritual error. This framing did not erase economic motives but layered them within a theological narrative that legitimized empire domestically and internationally. In the Americas themselves, religious landscapes transformed profoundly. Cathedrals rose atop former ceremonial centers. Christian iconography filled public spaces. Parish bells regulated daily rhythms, marking time, labor, and worship. Yet beneath these transformations, indigenous spiritual memory endured, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, often interwoven with new forms. When viewed calmly and analytically, religion's role in European expansion was neither incidental nor singular. It provided moral vocabulary for empire. It structured institutional presence. It shaped education and law. It justified governance. It inspired genuine missionary dedication. And it generated ethical debates that echoed across continents. Through the partnership of the Spanish crown and church institutions, expa notion acquired a sacred dimension, one that framed conquest not solely as acquisition of land, but as extension of faith, a framing that profoundly influenced how empire understood itself and how it sought to be understood by history. When European expansion into the Americas moved beyond exploration and into sustained settlement, economic structures quickly became the organizing framework of colonial life. What had begun as expeditions seeking routes and resources evolved into systems designed to extract wealth, cultivate commodities, and integrate new territories into expanding global trade networks. The economics of colonization did not rest on a single resource or method. It formed through overlapping pursuits: precious metals, agricultural production, land control, and labor organization, each shaping how colonial societies developed. In the early decades of contact, one of the most immediate economic motivations centered on precious metals, particularly gold and silver. Reports of gold ornaments, ceremonial objects, and river deposits captured European imagination quickly. Expeditions were often financed with the expectation that mineral wealth would repay investment many times over. Initial gold acquisition frequently relied on looting or tribute extraction from indigenous communities. Expeditions demanded gold objects or levied quotas upon local populations. Over time, however, easily accessible surface deposits proved limited, and attention shifted toward organized mining operations. Silver would ultimately become even more transformative than gold. Major silver deposits discovered in regions such as Zacatecas in present-day Mexico and Potosí in present-day Bolivia reshaped colonial economies profoundly. Potosí, situated high in the Andes, grew into one of the largest urban centers in the world during the 16th century, driven almost entirely by silver extraction. Mining required infrastructure: shafts, drainage systems, refining facilities, and transport networks. Colonial authorities organized labor drafts to sustain these operations. In the Andes, existing Inca labor taxation systems were adapted into colonial frameworks, compelling indigenous communities to provide mining labor under rotational quotas. Silver did not remain in the Americas. It flowed outward along transatlantic and transpacific trade routes. Spanish treasure fleets transported bullion to Europe, where it financed imperial administration, warfare, and trade deficits. From Europe, silver moved onward into Asian markets, particularly China, where it functioned as a primary currency medium. Thus, American mines became central nodes within a global economic web, linking Andean mountains to European capitals and Asian trading ports. While precious metals generated immediate imperial revenue, agricultural production soon emerged as an equally significant economic pillar. Among the most profitable crops cultivated in colonial territories was sugar. Sugar cane had been grown in Mediterranean and Atlantic island plantations prior to American colonization, but Caribbean and Brazilian climates proved exceptionally suited to large-scale cultivation. Fertile soils, long growing seasons, and access to maritime transport made plantation agriculture economically attractive. Sugar production required intensive labor at every stage: planting, cutting, milling, boiling, and refining. Processing had to occur quickly after harvest to prevent spoilage, leading to the construction of sugar mills near plantations. Plantation systems developed as large, land-intensive estates dedicated to monocrop production for export markets. Unlike subsistence farming, plantations focused on profitability within global trade circuits. European demand for sugar rose steadily. Eli, once considered a luxury, spiced sugar became increasingly integrated into European diets, sweetening beverages, preserving fruits, and appearing in confectionery. As demand grew, plantation expansion followed. Land ownership structures underpinned plantation economics. Colonial authorities granted large tracts of land to settlers, investors, and military figures. These land grants, sometimes called encomiendas, or later haciendas, depending on region and period, conferred not only territory but often rights to indigenous labor within those territories. The encomienda system in Spanish colonies functioned as an early labor and tribute arrangement. Indigenous communities were assigned to Spanish encomenderos, who were responsible for Christian instruction and protection in exchange for labor and tribute. In practice, labor demands often proved heavy, drawing criticism even within Spain. Over time, reforms attempted to regulate or replace encomienda structures, though labor exploitation persisted in evolving forms. As plantation agriculture expanded, labor needs exceeded available local populations, particularly in regions where disease had drastically reduced indigenous demographic capacity. This labor shortage contributed to the development and expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas to work in plantations, mines, and estates. European traders established coastal trading networks in West and Central Africa, exchanging goods for captives who were then shipped across the Atlantic in brutal maritime voyages. The integration of enslaved labor into plantation economies transformed global trade patterns. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and later coffee plantations depended heavily on enslaved African labor. Plantation output moved to European markets, generating profit that financed further colonial expanse. Ion and commercial investment. This system formed part of what historians often call the triangular trade. European manufactured goods were shipped to Africa. Enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas. Colonial commodities were exported to Europe. Each leg reinforced the others economically. Plantation agriculture reshaped landscapes as well. Forests were cleared for cane fields. Irrigation systems were constructed. Soil exhaustion became an issue in monocrop environments, prompting plantation expansion into new territories. Beyond sugar, other export crops emerged regionally. Tobacco cultivation flourished in parts of the Caribbean and North America. Cotton production expanded later, particularly in regions suited to its growth. Indigo, cacao, and coffee joined global commodity circuits, diversifying colonial export economies. Land ownership patterns reinforced social hierarchies. Large estate owners accumulated wealth and political influence. Smaller farmers and laborers operated within subordinate economic positions. Racial hierarchies intertwined with economic systems, particularly in plantation societies, dependent on enslaved labor. Urban centers developed alongside economic extraction zones. Mining cities, port towns, and administrative capitals facilitated trade flow. Warehouses stored commodities awaiting shipment. Financial institutions managed credit, insurance, and investment, tied to colonial ventures. Shipping networks became increasingly structured. Convoys transported precious metals under armed escort. Merchant fleets carried agricultural goods on scheduled routes aligned with harvest cycles and market demand. Insurance markets emerged to mitigate financial risk associated with long-distance maritime trade. Investors financed plantations and mines with expectations of high return. Global price systems began integrating colonial output. An increase in silver supply influenced European inflation. Sugar availability shifted dietary patterns. Tobacco and cacao consumption altered social habits. Colonial economies were not isolated. They fed into worldwide economic transformation. Labor systems evolved continuously in response to demographic, economic, and regulatory pressures. In some regions, wage labor emerged alongside coerced labor systems. Free settlers, indentured servants, indigenous workers, and enslaved Africans participated in layered labor hierarchies. Indentured servitude offered Europeans passage to colonies in exchange for fixed-term labor contracts. After service completion, some gained land or wages, contributing to settler population growth. Colonial administrations implemented legal codes regulating labor obligations, property rights, and trade taxation. These codes varied across empires but shared the goal of maximizing economic output. Infrastructure investments supported economic extraction. Roads connected mines to ports. Bridges spanned rivers. Mule trains transported silver across mountain routes. Shipyards constructed vessels dedicated to colonial trade. Financial flows linked colonies to European banking centers. Bullion financed wars, royal courts, and commercial expansion. Merchant wealth funded urban development and early capitalist enterprises. The economics of colonization also influenced cultural exchange. European dietary habits changed with the introduction of American crops like maize and potatoes, even as sugar and tobacco reshaped consumption patterns. Colonial wealth fueled artistic patronage, architectural projects, and scientific research within Europe. At the same time, economic systems imposed profound social transformations within the Americas. Indigenous communities adapted to tribute systems, labor drafts, and market participation. Africa. In diasporic cultures emerged within plantation societies, blending traditions under conditions of coercion. Economic motives often drove territorial expansion beyond initial settlements. New lands meant new plantations, new mines, new trade ports. Competition between European empires intensified as each sought control over profitable regions. Mercantilist policies structured colonial trade. Colonies exported raw materials to mother countries and imported manufactured goods in return, reinforcing economic dependence within imperial systems. Smuggling and informal trade networks developed, where regulations proved restrictive, illustrating the complexity of colonial commerce. Over time, colonial economies diversified. Local manufacturing, ranching, and regional trade supplemented export industries. Yet precious metals and plantation crops remained dominant pillars of imperial wealth. From a calm, analytical perspective, the economics of colonization functioned as an interconnected system rather than isolated pursuits. Gold and silver financed empire. Sugar and cash crops sustained trade profits. Land ownership structured power. Labor systems supplied production capacity. Shipping networks linked continents. Financial institutions managed risk and investment. Together, these elements integrated the Americas into a rapidly globalizing economy. The Atlantic and Pacific became commercial corridors through which wealth circulated continuously. Colonization, in this economic sense, was not only territorial expansion but systemic incorporation, the weaving of new lands into existing trade webs that stretched from European capitals to African coasts to Asian markets. And within this system, resources extracted from American soil reshaped global economies for centuries to come. Carried in ships' holds as bullion, sugar, tobacco, and countless other commodities that connected continents through commerce. As European presence in the Americas moved beyond the era of initial voyages and expeditions, the character of expansion began to change. Exploration, once defined by coastal mapping, tentative alliances, and resource scouting, gradually gave way to permanence. Ships still crossed the Atlantic, but increasingly they carried not only sailors and soldiers, but administrators, clergy, settlers, craftsmen, and families. The objective was no longer simply to reach new lands, but to remain in them, to govern them, and to reorganize them within imperial systems that stretched back across the ocean. This shift required structure. Temporary encampments and expeditionary outposts were not sufficient to sustain long-term control or economic extraction. European empires began establishing colonial governments, administrative frameworks designed to regulate land, labor, taxation, law, and trade. These governments operated as extensions of royal authority, translating imperial policy into daily governance across vast and unfamiliar territories. In the Spanish Empire, One of the most significant administrative units established in the Americas was the Viceroyalty. Among the earliest and most influential was New Spain, formally organized in the 16th century. Its jurisdiction encompassed much of present-day Mexico, parts of Central America, Caribbean territories, and even extended administrative influence into the Philippines through Pacific trade networks. The viceroy, appointed by the Spanish crown, functioned as the monarch's representative, a governing figure tasked with enforcing royal law, overseeing taxation, regulating trade, supervising colonial officials, and maintaining political order. Though geographically distant from Spain, the viceroyalty was designed to replicate imperial authority as faithfully as possible. Beneath, the viceroy operated layered bureaucracies. Audiencias, high courts with administrative powers, adjudicated legal disputes and provided oversight of colonial governance. Governors managed provinces. Municipal councils, known as cabildos, governed individual cities, addressing urban planning, public works, and local regulation. This administrative layering allowed empires to manage territories far larger than any single official could directly control. European legal systems accompanied these governance structures. Spanish colonial law drew from a combination of Castilian legal codes, royal decrees, and ecclesiastical regulations. Legal frameworks addressed property rights, labor obligations, taxation, criminal law, and social hierarchy. Written documentation became central to governance. Land grants were recorded, census data collected, legal disputes archived. Bureaucracy relied on paper, reports traveling by ship between colonies in Europe, carrying information that informed policy decisions across oceans. Law courts functioned as arenas where colonial subjects, European settlers, indigenous communities, mixed populations, could bring petitions, grievances, and claims. While power imbalances influenced outcomes, the existence of legal forums shaped colonial social dynamics. Land ownership systems formed another pillar of permanent settlement. Colonial authorities distributed land through grants, rewarding settlers, military officers, and investors. Estates known as haciendas in Spanish territories grew into large agricultural and ranching enterprises, producing crops and livestock for regional and export markets. Urban planning reflected European models. Cities were laid out according to grid systems radiating from central plazas. At the plaza's heart stood the cathedral and government buildings, architectural symbol S of church and state authority. Streets extended outward in ordered blocks, housing merchants, artisans, and residents organized by social and economic status. This spatial organization embodied administrative philosophy: order, hierarchy, and centralized oversight. Infrastructure development followed settlement growth. Roads connected inland cities to coastal ports. Bridges spanned rivers. Warehouses stored goods awaiting shipment. Fortifications defended strategic harbors from rival empires and piracy. Permanent settlement also required demographic expansion. European migrants, voluntary settlers, soldiers completing service, merchants seeking opportunity, established families and communities abroad. Intermarriage between Europeans and indigenous populations produced new social categories, often referred to within colonial caste systems. These caste systems classified individuals based on ancestry, shaping legal rights, taxation, and occupational access. Though rigid in theory, social mobility and regional variation complicated their application. Religious institutions embedded themselves deeply within settlement structures. Church parishes organized community life. Baptism, marriage, and burial rites regulated population records. Monasteries, convents, and missions extended religious presence into rural areas. Education systems emerged through ecclesiastical sponsorship. Mission schools taught Christian doctrine, literacy, and vocational skills. Universities were eventually established in major colonial cities, training clergy, lawyers, and administrators. Language played a transformative role. Spanish became the administrative and legal language in many colonial regions. Indigenous languages persisted, particularly in rural areas, but bilingualism developed where governance required communication across cultures. Cultural transformation unfolded gradually. European dress, dietary habits, architectural styles, and social customs entered colonial societies. Yet this process was never one-directional. Indigenous agricultural practices, foods, artistic motifs, and technologies influenced colonial life in return. Markets became cultural exchange zones. European goods, Textiles, metal tools, livestock circulated alongside indigenous crafts, foods, and materials. Economic integration fostered social interaction. Governance extended into labor regulation as well. Colonial authorities oversaw tribute systems, labor drafts, and wage work arrangements. Legal codes attempted, sometimes imperfectly, to regulate working conditions, taxation, and employer obligations. Taxation funded colonial administration. Tribute payments, mining revenues, trade tariffs, and agricultural levies financed bureaucratic salaries, military defense, infrastructure, and church operations. Communication with Europe remained slow but structured. Official correspondence traveled via scheduled fleets. Royal decrees issued in Spain could take months to reach colonial capitals, requiring local officials to exercise discretionary governance in the interim. Colonial defense systems developed alongside governance. Fortresses guarded key ports, militias formed among settler populations, naval patrols protected shipping lanes vital to imperial economies. Judicial systems addressed not only criminal law but also civil disputes, property claims, inheritance conflicts, commercial disagreements. Courts became central to maintaining order within socially diverse populations. Municipal councils regulated markets, sanitation, construction standards, and urban policing. Public works projects, aqueducts, roads, drainage systems reflected administrative investment in long-term settlement viability. Over time, colonial societies developed regional identities, Creole populations, people of European descent born in the Americas, emerged as influential social groups. Though loyal to imperial structures initially, their distinct experiences would later shape political movements. Governance structures adapted to local conditions. Frontier regions required flexible administration due to distance and communication delays. Remote settlements often blended military, missionary, and civil authority within single outposts. Economic governance intertwined with political administration. Trade monopolies regulated colonial exports. Certain ports were designated as exclusive trade hubs to control customs revenue. Smuggling, however, flourished where regulations proved restrictive. Cultural transformation manifested in architecture, language, cuisine, and social rituals. Wheat fields appeared where maize had dominated. Vineyards and olive groves were planted in climates suited to Mediterranean crops, yet indigenous food staples, maize, potatoes, cacao, remained foundational, influencing colonial diets deeply. Festivals blended traditions. Christian holy days incorporated indigenous music, dance, and artistic symbolism. Public ceremonies reinforced both religious devotion and imperial loyalty. Artistic production reflected cultural synthesis. Church murals incorporated indigenous visual motifs. Sculptures blended European iconography with local materials and techniques. Administrative permanence also required record preservation. Archives stored legal documents, land titles, baptismal registries, and government correspondence. These archives became repositories of colonial memory and governance continuity. Colonial capitals functioned as administrative nerve centers. Mexico City, built atop the former Mexica capital of Tenochtitlan, exemplified this transformation. Imperial governance layered onto pre-existing urban foundations. From these capitals radiated authority, legal, economic, military, and religious, across provinces and settlements. The shift from exploration to administration represented a fundamental turning point. Exploration sought knowledge and opportunity. Administration sought control and continuity. Ships still crossed oceans, but now they connected bureaucracies rather than expeditions. Permanent settlements anchored imperial presence physically and institutionally. They institutionalized European legal systems, reshaped land ownership, embedded religious structures, and facilitated cultural exchange and transformation. And through entities like New Spain, empires translated distant monarchies into lived governance across continents, transforming encounter into empire, and exploration into administration that would endure for centuries. As the processes of exploration, alliance building, disease exchange, religious transformation, economic extraction, and colonial governance unfolded across the Americas, their consequences did not remain confined to the Western Hemisphere. What emerged instead was a gradual, far-reaching shift in global power, one that reshaped trade networks, altered demographic patterns, recalibrated European political hierarchies, and helped lay structural foundations for what would later be recognized as the early modern world. This shift did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded over generations, quietly, cumulatively, as ships moved back and forth across the Atlantic, carrying metals, crops, people, and ideas in ever-increasing volume. The conquest of the Americas was not simply territorial expansion. It was the opening of a hemispheric exchange system that reoriented global connections. Global trade patterns were among the first arenas to transform. Before transatlantic integration, European commerce had been oriented primarily toward the Mediterranean, the Silk Roads, and Indian Ocean trade systems. Access to Asian goods, spices, silks, porcelains depended on Eastern intermediaries and long overland or maritime routes. With the incorporation of the Americas, Europe gained direct access to entirely new resource bases. Silver from American mines flowed into European treasuries at unprecedented scale. This influx of bullion increased monetary supply, stimulating commercial activity but also contributing to inflation, a phenomenon historians often call the price revolution. European states used American silver to finance wars, bureaucracies, and maritime expansion. Spain, as the primary early recipient of this wealth, rose rapidly as a dominant imperial power in the 16th century. Yet silver's influence extended far beyond Europe through trade networks connecting Spanish America to Asia, particularly via Pacific routes linking Mexico to the Philippines. American silver entered Chinese markets, where it was highly valued as currency. Thus, Andean and Mexican mines became linked to East Asian economies, integrating continents within a single commercial web. Agricultural commodities followed similar pathways. Sugar, tobacco, cacao, and later coffee entered European consumption patterns, reshaping diets and social customs. Sugar transformed from luxury spice to daily staple. Chocolate beverages moved from Mesoamerican ritual use into European aristocratic culture before diffusing more broadly. Conversely, American crops traveled eastward. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cassava entered European, African, and Asian agricultural systems. The potato, in particular, proved calorically efficient and adaptable to diverse climates, supporting population growth in parts of Europe. This biological and agricultural exchange, often called the Columbian Exchange, reshaped global food security and ecological systems. Livestock moved westward as well. Horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep transformed American landscapes and mobility patterns. Plains societies in North America, for example, incorporated horse culture into hunting, trade, and warfare practices within generations of equine introduction. Trade routes multiplied accordingly. Atlantic shipping lanes connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in triangular commercial systems. Pacific routes linked American silver to Asian markets. Merchant capitalism expanded to manage risk, credit, and commodity distribution. Insurance markets, joint stock companies, and early financial instruments emerged partly to manage the scale of transoceanic trade. Demographic transformation accompanied economic integration. The movement of Europeans into the Americas established settler populations that would grow over centuries. Migration included soldiers, missionaries, administrators, farmers, artisans, and families seeking opportunity or land. Simultaneously, the forced migration of enslaved Africans reshaped demographic composition across plantation regions. The transatlantic slave trade relocated millions of individuals, embedding African diaspora cultures deeply within American societies. Indigenous populations faced profound demographic disruption due to disease, labor systems, and social upheaval, though survival and cultural continuity persisted in diverse forms. These converging migrations created new social formations. Mixed ancestry populations emerged. Cultural syncretism blended languages, religions, cuisines, and artistic traditions. Colonial societies became demographically complex, structured by hierarchies yet shaped by interaction. Urban centers grew where administrative and economic activity concentrated. Mexico City, Lima, Havana, and others, functioning as imperial capitals in the Americas. Political power within Europe shifted alongside economic gain. Spain's early dominance rested heavily on American bullion. Wealth financed military campaigns across Europe. From Italy to the Low Countries, Spanish influence peaked during the 16th century, supported by transatlantic revenue. Portugal, though smaller, leveraged maritime trade networks connecting Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Other European powers observed and adapted. England, France, and the Netherlands entered colonial competition, establishing settlements, plantations, and trading posts across the Americas and Caribbean. Colonial rivalry became an extension of European geopolitical conflict. Naval power grew in importance. Control of sea routes meant control of trade wealth. Shipbuilding industries expanded. Naval warfare technology advanced. Maritime empires replaced landlocked ones as dominant global actors. Colonial wealth funded state centralization. Standing armies, bureaucracies, and diplomatic networks required sustained financing. Resources colonial economies helped provide. The beginnings of capitalist economic structures accelerated within this context. Investment in voyages, plantations, and mines required pooled capital. Risk distribution led to the formation of early corporations and stock ventures. Commercial law evolved to regulate international trade, credit, and insurance. Urban merchant classes gained influence within European politics as trade wealth rivaled traditional aristocratic land power. Intellectual transformation accompanied economic and political change. The expansion of geographic knowledge challenged medieval worldviews. Maps expanded to include new continents. Scientific inquiry into navigation, astronomy, and natural history accelerated. Colonial encounters also reshaped Europe. In philosophy, debates emerged about human diversity, governance, religion, and rights, sometimes exploitative, sometimes reformist. Exposure to new societies prompted reflection on Europe's own political and moral systems. Technological exchange occurred as well. Metallurgical knowledge, agricultural techniques, and botanical discoveries moved across continents, enriching scientific understanding. Environmental transformation followed demographic and economic integration. European crops reshaped American agriculture. American crops altered. Old world farming, livestock grazing transformed ecosystems. Deforestation accompanied plantation expansion. The Atlantic itself became a corridor not just of goods, but of ideas. Missionaries carried theology. Merchants carried news. Administrators carried legal frameworks. Cultural exchange flowed continuously. Over time, colonial systems matured into imperial infrastructures. Governance stabilized. Trade regularized. Settlement populations expanded. Cultural institutions entrenched themselves. The cumulative effect was the emergence of a world more interconnected than any prior era. No continent remained isolated. Economic fluctuations in American silver output could influence European inflation, and Asian trade balances, crop failures in one hemisphere could be mitigated by imports from another. This integration marked the early contours of globalization. Yet the shift in global power was neither uniform nor uncontested. Indigenous resistance persisted. Enslaved communities resisted bondage. Rival empires clashed over territory and trade access. Colonial wealth enriched some European states while indebting others. Economic dependency emerged alongside prosperity. The transformation was structural, but not harmonious. It is important, in concluding reflection, to resist triumphal framing. The conquest of the Americas did not simply elevate Europe through ingenuity or inevitability. It was shaped by contingency, disease dynamics, alliance politics, ecological exchange, and technological timing. Its consequences included wealth accumulation and global integration, but also demographic collapse, coerced labor systems, and cultural upheaval. The modern world that began to take shape in this period carried both expansion and disruption within its foundations. Trade networks grew denser, populations became more mobile, empires extended across oceans, economies intertwined, knowledge expanded. But these developments emerged through encounters marked as much by imbalance as by exchange. When viewed from a long historical horizon, the conquest of the Americas represents less a singular victory than a turning point, the moment when previously separate hemispheres became permanently entangled. From that entanglement flowed the systems that would define modernity: global trade, colonial empires, demographic intermixing, financial capitalism, and planetary ecological exchange. And so the shift in global power did not arrive with a single battle or proclamation. It unfolded gradually, in silver shipments crossing oceans, in sugar filling European markets, in new crops feeding distant populations, in maps redrawn by candlelight. A slow rebalancing of the world, one that connected continents irreversibly and set humanity upon a shared historical trajectory whose consequences continued to unfold long after the sails of those early crossings disappeared beyond the horizon.